The lone gunslinger saves a Christian girl from auction, but the pagan clan arrives at his door. The metallic click of silver coins hitting the auctioneer's palm echoed through the frost-bitten air like a death knell. Bjorn's weathered fingers trembled, not from the brutal winter wind cutting through the frontier village, but from the weight of what he'd just done. His last coins, gone for her. The girl's eyes burned with something he'd never seen in a slave before. Defiance that could ignite kingdoms or destroy them entirely. Astrid. Even her name felt dangerous on his tongue as he led her away from the jeering crowd of pagan traders, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the bitter air. But freedom was an illusion in these godless borderlands. The thunder of hooves shattered the silence behind them, growing louder with each heartbeat. Bjorn's hand instinctively found his weapon, cold steel that had tasted blood in more battles than he cared to remember. The exile's burden weighed heavier than ever, as he realized this wasn't just another random act of violence in the wilderness. "They're coming for me," Astrid whispered, her fingers clutching something hidden beneath her torn robes. "What I carry, it could unite the kingdoms, Bjorn, or burn them all to ash." 3 riders emerged from the swirling snow like harbingers of doom, their horses' breath steaming in the Arctic air. But something was wrong. Their armor bore both Christian crosses and pagan runes, an impossible combination that made Bjorn's blood run cold. "Traitress!" The lead rider's voice boomed across the frozen landscape, his sword already singing through the air as he drew it from its sheath. Astrid's grip tightened on Bjorn's arm, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "They don't know what I really am. If they discover the truth, we're both dead." An arrow whistled past Bjorn's ear, so close he felt its fletching brush his skin before it buried itself deep in a snow-laden pine. The tree shuddered, dropping its white burden like a funeral shroud. Antes de continuarmos com essa história incrível, preciso te fazer alerta importante. Muitos inscritos têm relatado que o YouTube removeu suas inscrições sem aviso. Dá só uma conferida rápida no botão vermelho aí embaixo para garantir que você ainda está inscrito no canal. Não quero que você perca nenhum conteúdo exclusivo que vem por aí. E já que você está aí, deixa aquele like poderoso que me ajuda muito com o algoritmo. E me conta nos comentários de qual cidade você está assistindo. Adoro conhecer cada pessoa incrível que faz parte dessa comunidade. Sua participação faz toda a diferença. Vamos interagir. The familiar weight of his pistol filled Bjorn's palm as he drew it in one fluid motion. Muscle memory, forged in countless battles across these cursed lands. His exile had stripped him of clan, honor, and homeland, but it hadn't dulled his reflexes. "Stay behind me," he growled, positioning himself between Astrid and the approaching riders. The wind carried the scent of smoke from distant hearths, mixing with the metallic tang of approaching violence. The lead rider pulled his mount to a halt just 20 paces away, close enough for Bjorn to see the strange symbols etched into his helm, runes that seemed to writhe in the dim light like. When the man spoke, his accent was neither fully Norse nor Christian, but something altogether more unsettling. "The girl belongs to neither realm, Wanderer. She is between worlds, as are we all now." Astrid stepped forward, and Bjorn felt the change in her immediately. Gone was the frightened slave from the auction block. In her place stood something else entirely. Someone who commanded attention even from armed warriors. "I took nothing that wasn't already mine by right," she declared, her voice carrying across the snow-covered clearing with unexpected authority. "The old bloodlines run deeper than your new oaths, Håkon." The name hit the lead rider like a physical blow. His horse pranced nervously as he fought to maintain control, both of his mount and his composure. "You dare speak the old names, daughter of—" "Careful," Astrid interrupted, her hand moving to whatever she kept hidden. "Some truths are too dangerous for these borderlands. Even you know that." Bjorn's finger found the trigger of his weapon, though he had no idea what ancient powers he'd stumbled into. The bitter wind howled through the pines, and for the first time in years of bitter exile, he sensed that his choice might mean something greater than mere survival, even if it killed them both. The sound that escaped Hakon's throat wasn't quite human, somewhere between a growl and a sob. His sword arm trembled as recognition dawned in his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked like breaking ice. "Show him your face, sister." The word hit Bjorn like a warhammer to the chest. Sister. Astrid's hood fell away completely, revealing features that made his blood turn to poison in his veins. The same sharp cheekbones, the same steel-gray eyes, the same scar running from temple to jaw. A scar he'd given her himself 12 winters ago, when she'd tried to stop him from burning their family's hall. "Hello, brother," Astrid whispered, and her voice carried the weight of 1,000 graves. "Did you think the flames took me with the others?" Bjorn's pistol wavered in his grip. The faces of the dead rose before him like smoke. Their mother's scream as the roof collapsed. Their father's final curse. The children who'd never escaped the inferno of his making. All because he'd believed the Christian priests who'd told him his pagan family were demons walking the earth. "You died," he breathed. "I watched you burn. You watched me learn." Astrid stepped closer, and now he could see the marks covering her arms. Ritual scars that pulsed with their own dark light. "The flames taught me truths you never imagined, about what we really are, what our bloodline truly carries." Hakon urged his horse forward, his scarred face grim with purpose. She survived because the old gods wouldn't let their vessel perish. The prophecies couldn't be fulfilled without her. "What prophecies?" Bjorn's voice was barely audible above the howling wind. Astrid smiled, and it was the most terrible thing he'd ever seen. "The ones you've been fulfilling every step of the way, dear brother. Every choice you think you made freely. Buying me at auction, bringing me here to the crossroads, standing with your weapon drawn under the blood moon." She gestured to the crimson orb hanging low in the winter sky. "All of it written in the old tongue, all of it necessary." The hidden object in her robes began to glow with sickly green light, casting twisted shadows across the snow. When she finally revealed it, Bjorn's knees nearly buckled. Their father's ceremonial dagger, the one he'd watched melt in the fire that consumed their home. The blade that had sacrificed 100 Christian prisoners to the old gods. "The ritual requires 3 elements," Astrid continued, her voice rising with otherworldly authority. "The weapon of faith." She nodded toward his pistol. the blood of the kinslayer. Her eyes locked onto his, and the willing sacrifice of the one who destroyed everything. The other two riders threw back their hoods, revealing faces Bjorn had murdered in dreams every night for 12 years. His cousins, his uncle, all bearing the same ritual scars, all very much alive, all watching him with eyes that reflected centuries of patient hunger. "The dead don't rest easy in cursed ground, brother," his uncle called out, his voice carrying the sound of wind through empty skulls. "And you consecrated these lands with so much innocent blood." Astrid raised the dagger toward the blood moon, and the blade began to sing. A sound like children weeping, mixed with the roar of flames. One more death, and the barrier between worlds falls forever. The old gods return. The new god's reign ends. Bjorn realized with crystal clarity that pulling the trigger would complete the ritual just as surely as not pulling it. His choice had been stolen 12 years ago the moment he'd lit that first torch. "Choose quickly, kinslayer," Astrid whispered. "Dawn comes, and prophecies wait for no one." The blood moon's crimson light suddenly flickered like a dying candle, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently across the snow. Astrid's ritual dagger trembled in her grip as an impossible sound cut through the winter air, the slow, deliberate clapping of hands. From the tree line stepped a figure that made every soul present recoil in terror. Father Magnus, the Christian priest who had filled Bjorn's head with poison 12 years ago, emerged from the shadows with a smile that belonged in the deepest circles of hell. "Magnificent performance, children," the priest said, his voice carrying an authority that made the very air grow thick. "Though you've missed the most delicious part of this tale." Hakon's horse reared in panic, nearly throwing its rider. "Impossible. We killed you. We watched you burn in the church." "You burned an empty shell," Magnus interrupted, removing his clerical robes to reveal armor beneath. Not Christian mail, but something far older. Runes covered every inch of the blackened steel, pulsing with the same sickly light as Astrid's blade. "Did you truly think the old gods would choose a mere girl as their vessel?" The priest's form began to shift and writhe, his flesh taking on the consistency of smoke and shadow. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of centuries, the sound of ancient trees groaning in primordial forests. "I am the true herald of the old ways. The Christian facade was merely convenient. So much easier to corrupt a kinslayer when he believes he serves the light." Bjorn felt his sanity cracking like ice under spring thaw. "You made me kill them. You said they were demons." "They were obstacles," the thing wearing Magnus's face replied with casual cruelty. "Your family's bloodline was too pure, too powerful. The ritual required their corruption first, then their deaths. And who better to accomplish both than their beloved son, filled with righteous fury?" Astrid staggered backward, the ritual dagger falling from nerveless fingers. "No, the prophecy said I was chosen. The flames spared me because I needed you alive to complete this moment," Magnus snarled, his true form now visible. Something that had never been human, something that predated both Christ and Odin. "The old gods didn't save you, child. I did. Every step of your survival, every scar on your flesh, every power you thought you'd gained, all gifts from me." The creature's laughter was the sound of breaking bones. "The barrier between worlds doesn't fall tonight, fools. It was never meant to. You're not completing an ancient ritual. You're feeding me enough despair and betrayal to manifest fully in this realm." Bjorn watched in horror as his sister's scars began to glow brighter, her body convulsing as if something were trying to claw its way out from inside. Håkon and his riders were backing their horses away, their weapons useless against this revelation. "The beautiful truth," Magnus continued, his form growing larger and more terrible with each passing second, "is that every choice you made tonight serves my purpose. Kill her, and her anguish feeds me. Spare her, and your guilt sustains me." The prophecy was never about the old gods returning. It was about something far older awakening. The blood moon overhead pulsed once, twice, then went completely dark. In that moment of absolute darkness, Bjorn heard Astrid scream. Not in pain, but in rage so pure it seemed to ignite the very air around them. When moonlight returned, everything had changed, and the true nightmare was only beginning. The scream that tore from Astrid's throat shattered more than silence. It cracked reality itself. But as the sound peaked, something impossible happened. Her voice split into two distinct tones, one familiar and broken, the other deep and resonant with ancient authority. When the moonlight returned, two figures stood where Astrid had been. The girl remained, gasping and pale, her ritual scars now dark and lifeless. But beside her stood a man Bjorn had mourned for 12 years, his father, Ericsson the Bloodaxe, exactly as he'd appeared the night of the fire. No burns, no wounds, just the same iron-gray beard and eyes like winter storms. "My son, the binding was perfect. You were trapped inside her." "Trapped?" Ericsson's laugh was genuine thunder. "I've been waiting, creature. 12 years watching through my daughter's eyes as you orchestrated this pathetic charade." The thing wearing Magnus's face began to shift more frantically, its borrowed flesh rippling like disturbed water. "The girl was my vessel. I created her survival. You found what I allowed you to find." Ericsson stepped forward, and with each footfall, the ground beneath him bloomed with living flame. Not destructive fire, but something ancient and clean. Did you truly believe the Bloodaxe line would fall to such crude manipulation? Bjorn's world tilted sideways as comprehension struck like a warhammer. "The fire. You planned it. You let me? I let you think you'd killed us, yes." His father's eyes held infinite sadness mixed with terrible purpose. "Because this monster needed to believe its victory was complete. It needed to be absolutely certain it had corrupted our bloodline beyond redemption." Hakon's mount reared again, but this time not in fear, in recognition. "Lord Ericsson," the rider breathed, dismounting to kneel in the snow. "The prophecy was never about the old gods returning. It was about you." Astrid stumbled forward, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Father, I felt you die. I felt the flames take you. You felt me anchor my spirit to yours, to survive Magnus's true form. Ericsson's expression darkened as he turned back to the writhing creature. What you've been feeding on for 12 years wasn't despair, demon. It was my rage, growing stronger with each moment you tormented my children. Magnus's stolen form began to collapse, revealing something underneath that hurt to look at directly. You cannot banish me. I am bound to this realm now. Bound by what? Lies? Eriksson raised his hand, and Bjorn's pistol grew white-hot in his grip. Not with heat, but with purpose. My son's weapon was never meant to complete your ritual. It was forged in the embers of our hall, quenched in the tears of the innocent you claim to champion. The gun in Bjorn's hand began to sing, the same ethereal note as Astrid's dagger, but cleaner, stronger. When he looked down at it, he saw runes carved into the barrel that hadn't been there moments before. Runes that pulsed with golden light. One shot, Eriksson said softly. Aim true, my son. Send this pretender back to whatever void spawned it. But as Bjorn raised the weapon, Magnus smiled with too many teeth, its true form finally visible. Writhing tentacles and eyes like dying stars. Pull that trigger, Kinslayer, and watch your father's spirit die with me. We've been bound together for 12 years. Kill me, and you'll murder him all over again. Bjorn's finger froze on the trigger as his father's words echoed in his mind. But then something cold and terrible settled in his chest. The golden runes on his pistol weren't pulsing with holy light. They were counting down, like marks scratched into a cell wall by a prisoner marking his final days. You're lying, he whispered. But not to Magnus, to Eriksson. His father's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind those winter storm eyes. Something that looked almost like relief at being discovered. Bjorn, don't, Astrid started, but her voice cracked as she saw it too. The way their father stood, just slightly too close to Magnus. The way the creature's tentacles weren't recoiling from Eriksson's flames, but feeding on them. 12 years, Bjorn said, his voice hollow as a burial mound. You've been bound to this thing for 12 years, not fighting it, serving it. The thing wearing his father's face smiled, and it was the most heartbreaking sight Bjorn had ever witnessed. My brilliant son, you always were too clever for your own good. The fire that night, Astrid breathed, horror dawning in her eyes. You didn't die in it. You became it. Magnus needed a more convincing vessel. Eriksson's voice carried the sound of crackling logs and dying screams. Something that could manipulate you both with perfect precision. Who better than the father you loved more than life itself? Hakon's sword sang as he drew it, but his hands shook like autumn leaves. Lord Eriksson died that night. What are you? The creature stretched, and Bjorn watched his father's beloved features begin to melt like wax. I am what happens when a desperate father makes a bargain to save his children's lives. Magnus offered me a choice. Watch you both burn, or help him forge you into weapons he could use later. The golden runes on Bjorn's pistol pulsed faster, and he realized with sick certainty that each pulse was another piece of his soul being drained away. The weapon wasn't holy at all. It was a trap, and he'd been feeding it his guilt and love for 12 years. Every night you dreamed of us, the Eriksson thing continued, its voice becoming layered with Magnus's cruel tones. Every prayer you whispered for forgiveness, every tear you shed, all of it flowed through this gun, straight into our waiting maws. Astrid lurched forward, her ritual scars blazing back to life. But now Bjorn could see the truth. They weren't marks of survival or divine protection. They were feeding tubes. Channeling her pain, you arranged for me to be there. You knew Bjorn would sacrifice everything to save his sister? The thing laughed with their father's voice, and it was the sound of innocence dying. The ritual was never about summoning the old gods or opening barriers between worlds. It was about creating a perfect battery of anguish, powered by the most exquisite fuel, a family destroying itself out of love. Magnus's true form began to merge with the Eriksson shape, creating something that hurt to perceive directly. And now, dear children, comes the beautiful finale. Bjorn can shoot me and watch his father die screaming. Or he can lower the weapon and watch his sister be consumed slowly, piece by piece, while the man who raised him cheers. The blood moon pulsed overhead, and Bjorn felt the weight of understanding settle on him like burial stones. There was no winning this. There never had been. Every path led to feeding these monsters exactly what they craved most. But as despair threatened to swallow him whole, he noticed something the creatures had missed in their gloating. The runes on his gun weren't just counting down. They were spelling out a name, and it wasn't his. The name blazing across the runes made Bjorn's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Not his name, not his father's, not even Astrid's. Magnus. The pistol wasn't counting down his life or spelling out some ancient prophecy. It was revealing its true owner, and it had been Magnus's weapon from the very beginning. You see it now, the creature wearing his father's face whispered with satisfaction. 12 years ago, when the holy priest pressed that gun into your trembling hands and filled your head with righteous fury, whose weapon do you think you were really carrying? The golden runes pulsed brighter, and suddenly, Bjorn could see the truth etched in supernatural fire along the barrel. Every shot he'd fired in all these years of exile, every bandit, every rival, every innocent who'd gotten in his way, their blood had been an offering. Their deaths had been feeding this moment. The Christian girl you saved at auction, Magnus continued, his stolen features melting away entirely now. Look at her properly, Kinslayer. Astrid turned toward him, and as the creature's influence finally lifted, Bjorn saw what had been hidden beneath layers of supernatural deception. The bone structure of her face shifted like smoke clearing. Her eyes changed from gray to deep brown. Her hair darkened from golden wheat to raven black. She wasn't his sister at all. My name is Sigrun Bloodraven, she said, her voice now carrying a completely different accent, one that made Bjorn's scars ache with remembered pain. Daughter of Jarl Grimvar the Butcher, the man whose entire family you slaughtered in the raid on Blackstone Harbor. The memories crashed over him like a frozen wave. 7 years ago. The monastery's gold had been too tempting, the Christian priest's promises too sweet. He'd led Magnus's holy warriors against the pagan settlement, believing he was purging demons from the earth. But it had been a massacre, not soldiers, but families, children, elders. He'd put his blade through Jarl Grimvar personally. Then, watch the man's daughter, barely 14, throw herself from the burning watchtower into the icy fjord below. Her body had never been found. "You survived," he breathed. "I survived to hunt you." Sigrid's hand moved to her throat, where she pulled away what he'd thought was a slave's collar. Beneath it lay a ritual scar in the shape of a raven, the mark of a death-sworn oath. "Every step of this night was my design, Gunslinger. The auction, the chase, even learning to mimic your dead sister's appearance well enough to fool your guilt-drunk eyes." Hakon and his riders began to laugh, not with madness, but with grim satisfaction. They weren't some mystical clan touched by ancient powers. They were survivors of Blackstone Harbor, every one of them scarred by Bjorn's raid, all bound by the same death oath. "The beautiful irony," Magnus added, his tentacled form writhing with pleasure, "is that she came to me for power, begged me to help her craft the perfect revenge. I was content to simply feed on your mutual hatred, but then she proposed something far more artistic." Sigrid stepped closer, and now Bjorn could see his father's ceremonial dagger in her grip. Not a mystical relic, but a weapon she'd stolen from his family's burning hall 12 years ago. The blade that had been waiting all this time for the perfect moment to complete its work. "You destroyed 2 families that night, Bjorn," she whispered. "Mine with your sword, yours with your guilt. Now you get to watch both debts come due at once." The blood moon overhead pulsed once more, and Bjorn realized with crystalline horror that pulling the trigger would indeed complete a ritual, just not the one he'd thought. The gun had been counting shots, not days, and with Sigrid's true identity revealed, his finger on Magnus's weapon, surrounded by the ghosts of his victims. The final sacrifice wasn't going to be his father's spirit. It was going to be his soul. The blade trembled in Sigrid's grip as she raised it toward his throat, her eyes blazing with years of carefully nursed hatred. But as the steel caught the blood moon's crimson light, something impossible happened. The dagger screamed. Not the whistle of metal through air, but an actual human scream of agony. A voice Bjorn recognized with soul-crushing certainty. His sister's voice, his real sister's voice, trapped inside the ceremonial blade for 12 years. He breathed, and the weapon's shriek intensified, as if responding to her name. Sigrid's mask of vengeance cracked, confusion replacing bloodthirst as the dagger began to burn her palm. "What sorcery?" "Not sorcery," Magnus interrupted, his tentacled form writhing with what might have been panic. "Impossible. The girl died in the fire. I watched her soul flee. You watched it get trapped." A new voice cut through the night, like a sword through silk. From the shadows of the pine forest stepped a figure that made even Magnus recoil in terror. An elderly woman whose eyes held the weight of centuries, and whose fingers dripped with fresh blood. The Satyr Witch, Ragnhild the Boneless. "Hello, grandson," she said to Bjorn, her voice carrying warmth that felt like sunshine on frost. "I've been hunting this creature across 3 kingdoms to free your sister's spirit." Bjorn's knees buckled. His grandmother had been dead for 15 years. He'd watched the funeral pyre consume her body with his own eyes. The beauty of death magic, Ragnhild continued, stepping into the moonlight, is that it makes one very difficult to kill permanently, especially when one has unfinished business. She gestured toward Sigrid, who was now struggling to release the screaming dagger as it seared her flesh. Your father's blade was never just a weapon, child. It was a soul prison, designed to trap the spirits of those it killed. Magnus thought he was so clever, using it to anchor Astrid's essence, while convincing everyone she'd died. The blood moon pulsed, and suddenly the air filled with voices. Dozens of them, hundreds, all crying out from the blade in Sigrid's burning grip. Every soul the ceremonial dagger had ever claimed, trapped in steel and shadow for generations. The creature needed Astrid, alive but powerless. Ragnhild explained, her fingers weaving patterns in the air that made reality shimmer. A spirit bound to the family blade, feeding him information, manipulating events from beyond death's veil. She's been watching through the weapon every time you killed, grandson. Every time you carved another notch in your guilt. Magnus's stolen form began to collapse as the witch's power pressed against him. You cannot interfere, crone. The ritual is too far along. What ritual? Ragnhild's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. You fool, there never was a ritual. This entire night has been my spell, designed to bring you out of hiding so I could do this. She raised her bloodied hands toward the moon, and the crimson light suddenly blazed white-hot. The pain that erupted from every soul present was beyond description. Not physical agony, but the sensation of every lie they'd ever told themselves being burned away at once. When the light faded, 3 figures stood where Magnus had been writhing. The demon itself, now stripped of all its stolen faces and forms. The real Father Magnus, a terrified old priest who'd been possessed for 12 years. And between them, Bjorn's actual father, Eriksson, translucent but whole, his spirit finally freed from the creature's grip. "My son," he whispered, his ghostly form already beginning to fade. "I have so little time. The binding is breaking, but Astrid, she's still trapped in the blade. The choice is yours." Sigrid collapsed to her knees, the dagger falling from her ruined hands into the snow, where it continued to pulse with otherworldly light. Every soul trapped within was visible now, a writhing mass of the dead, with Astrid's spirit burning brightest at the core. "One touch will free them all," Ragnhild said softly. "But the blade's magic requires a replacement. One living soul must take their place to shatter the prison." The demon Magnus scrambled backward through the snow, its true form revealed as something small and pathetic without its stolen power. But as Bjorn reached for the screaming dagger, he heard Sigrid whisper words that stopped his heart cold. "The raid on Blackstone Harbor. It wasn't your idea, was it?" Through the blade's supernatural light, he could finally see the truth carved into its surface. Not runes of power, but a list of names. Every target Magnus had manipulated him into destroying over the years. Every holy crusade the demon had whispered into his ear. Astrid's voice rose from the steel, desperate and fading. "Brother, it wasn't your fault, but the choice is still yours." As his fingers closed around the burning metal, Bjorn realized that saving his sister would mean taking her place, trapped forever in a prison of souls, watching through steel eyes as someone else wielded the blade. Unless he could find another way to feed the weapon's hunger. His gaze fell on the cowering form of Magnus, and for the first time in 12 years, Bjorn smiled. The blade's weight felt like holding lightning itself as Bjorn closed his fingers around the screaming steel. Pain shot through his arm, but something else came with it. Memories that weren't his own. Astrid's memories, flowing through their connection like blood through an open wound. And in those stolen moments, he saw the truth that shattered everything. The night of the fire, 12 years ago. But not as he remembered it. Through Astrid's eyes, he watched himself enter their hall with Magnus at his side. But the priest wasn't there to corrupt him with Christian lies. Magnus was there to stop him. "No, Bjorn!" His sister's voice echoed from the past, desperate and terrified. "You can't do this to our family!" He watched his younger self smile with cold satisfaction as he poured oil across their father's sacred altar. Watched himself laugh as he lit the first torch. The Magnus in the memory was pleading, trying to pull him away from the flames, screaming about innocent lives. "I never turned you against your family," Magnus whispered from where he cowered in the snow, his demons stripped away to reveal a broken old priest. "You came to me already burning with hatred. I spent 12 years trying to contain what you really are." The dagger pulsed in Bjorn's grip, and more memories flooded through. His mother's final words as the smoke choked her. The berserker's curse runs too deep in his blood. The old gods made him for killing, nothing more. His father's dying declaration, spoken through flames and smoke. "My son died long before tonight. What wears his face now is something else entirely." Ragnhild's weathered features went pale as understanding dawned. "The binding spell, I cast it wrong. I've been hunting the wrong monster for 12 years. "No," Astrid's fading voice whispered from the blade. "You cast it perfectly, grandmother. You bound the demon. But the demon was never Magnus." The blood moon overhead suddenly blazed like a funeral pyre, and Sigrid began to laugh. Not with triumph, but with the edge of madness. The blood axe line doesn't carry warrior's courage. It carries berserker's rage. The kind that turns a man into a kinslayer for the pure joy of watching his loved ones burn. Every soul present turned to stare at Bjorn as the final piece clicked into place. The gunslinger, who'd spent years believing he was a corrupted crusader. The exile who'd convinced himself his murders were the result of demonic manipulation. The broken man who'd thought he was saving his sister out of love. All lies. Sweet, comfortable lies to hide what he'd always known in his black heart. He hadn't burned his family because a demon whispered in his ear. He'd done it because he wanted to. Because the screaming had sounded like music, and their terror had tasted like honey on winter air. "The curse skips generations," Ragnhild breathed, her hands trembling as she backed away. "Your grandfather, my husband, we thought it died with him, but it just waited." The dagger in his grip wasn't screaming anymore. It was singing. The same beautiful song he'd heard 12 years ago, as he'd watched his family's hall become their funeral pyre. Astrid's voice wasn't crying for help. She was welcoming him home. "Every man you've killed since," she whispered from the steel. "Every woman, every child. You felt it, didn't you, brother?" That moment when the light left their eyes and something warm bloomed in your chest. Bjorn's reflection in the bloody snow showed the truth at last. Not guilt-haunted eyes, but the cold satisfaction of a predator who'd finally stopped pretending to be prey. And as understanding settled over the clearing like fresh snow, one terrible question remained unanswered. If Bjorn was the real monster, what did that make the sister who'd been guiding his kills for 12 years? The dagger's song rose to a crescendo as Astrid's laughter echoed from within the steel. But then her voice shifted, not speaking to Bjorn, but past him, toward the tree line where shadows gathered like living smoke. "Welcome home, husband." The word hit the clearing like a warhammer striking stone. From the darkness between the pines stepped a figure that made every soul present freeze in recognition and terror. Tall, broad-shouldered, bearing scars that mapped a lifetime of violence across his arms and face. Jarl Grimvar the Butcher, very much alive. "My beloved daughter plays her role perfectly," he said, his voice carrying the weight of grinding millstones. The man Bjorn remembered putting his sword through 7 years ago walked forward without a care. Snowflakes melting on skin that should have been 7 years dead. Sigrid, the girl he'd thought was Grimvar's daughter, began to weep, but not from pain or fear, from relief so profound it shattered her composure entirely. "I told you I'd return for you," Grimvar continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "Even death couldn't keep me from honoring our wedding vows." The pieces crashed together in Bjorn's mind, like ships against jagged rocks. Sigrid wasn't Grimvar's daughter. She was his wife. The 14-year-old girl he'd watched throw herself from the burning watchtower hadn't been a child seeking death. She'd been a young bride following her husband into the afterlife. But if Grimvar was alive, then who had Bjorn killed that night in Blackstone Harbor? "My twin brother, Eric," Grimvar answered, as if reading his thoughts. "Younger by mere minutes, but he always was better at playing Lord while I handled the darker necessities." Ragnhild's weathered hands began weaving protection spells, her voice cracking with ancient fear. Grimvar bloodline was cursed, the brothers who could share death itself, each taking the other's place. When one falls in battle, yes, Grimvar smiled, and it was the expression of a wolf cornering wounded prey. "Eric played Jarl for 20 years, while I walked the paths between life and death, learning secrets that would drive lesser men mad." The blood moon overhead pulsed, and suddenly the clearing filled with shapes that defied comprehension. Warriors who moved like smoke and shadow, their weapons dripping with otherworldly cold. The true army of Blackstone Harbor, led by their true Jarl, returned from 7 years wandering the realm of the dead. "Every soul you've killed since that night," Grimvar continued. "Every drop of blood you've spilled, believing, strengthening the bridge between worlds so I could lead my warriors home. Bjorn's grip on the screaming dagger faltered as understanding crashed over him. Astrid, she's been my eyes in the world of the living. Yes, your dear sister trapped in steel, whispering suggestions in your ear, guiding you to targets whose deaths would serve my purpose. Grimvar's scarred face split into a grin that belonged in the deepest hells. Did you truly think your berserker's luck was natural? Every kill, perfectly timed. Every victim, chosen with supernatural precision. The ghostly form of Eriksson began to scream as the truth became clear. My daughter, what have you done to my daughter? I've given her purpose. Astrid's voice rose from the blade, but now it carried harmonics that had never been human. 12 years feeding on brother's guilt, growing stronger with each life he took in my name. I was never trapped, father. I was hunting. Sigrid rose to her feet, her burned hands already healing with unnatural speed. The wedding was never completed, beloved, she said to Grimvar. My soul has been anchored to the living world, waiting for you to return so we could finish the ritual. The shadow warriors began to circle the clearing, their eyes like dying stars in the blood moon's light. Father Magnus cowered against a pine tree, the broken priest finally understanding that his 12 years of torment had been orchestrated by something far worse than any Christian demon. One more death completes the binding, Grindar announced, his dead warriors raising their spectral weapons. One more soul fed to the blade, and the barrier falls permanently. The living and the dead become one kingdom, with me as its eternal king. But as Bjorn raised the singing dagger toward his own throat, Ragnhild's cackling laughter cut through the supernatural tension like a blade through silk. Foolish dead man, the witch snarled, her eyes blazing with power that made the air shimmer. Did you think I've spent 12 years hunting the wrong monster by accident? The earth beneath Grimvar's feet began to crack and smoke, revealing runes carved deep into the bedrock. Not Norse symbols, but something far older, something that predated both Christian cross and pagan hammer. The trap had been set long before tonight began, and everyone present had walked into it perfectly. The ancient runes carved into the bedrock blazed with primordial fire, as Ragnhild's true power erupted from the earth itself. But instead of targeting Grimvar or his shadow army, the witch's magic struck the screaming dagger in Bjorn's hands. Forgive me, child, she whispered to Astrid's trapped spirit. This was the only way. The blade shattered like breaking winter, releasing not just one soul, but hundreds. Every spirit that had been imprisoned within the steel across generations of bloodshed. But as Astrid's essence emerged, blazing with ethereal light, she wasn't the sister Bjorn remembered. 12 years of feeding on death and guiding his kills had transformed her into something else entirely. The binding was never about stopping you, grandmother, Astrid said, her spectral form towering above the clearing. It was about making me strong enough to do this. With a gesture that cracked reality itself, she seized Grimvar's army of shadows and began tearing them apart with her bare hands. Each destroyed warrior screamed as it dissolved, their essence flowing not into the blood moon above, but into the earth beneath their feet. You think death made you powerful? Astrid's laughter carried the sound of children playing and funeral bells ringing. I've been Death's favorite student for 12 years. Grimvar's scarred face went pale as his carefully assembled army crumbled before his eyes. Impossible! You're bound to serve my will. I served my will, she replied, turning toward Bjorn with eyes that held both infinite love and infinite sorrow. Every kill I guided you to wasn't feeding him, brother. It was feeding me, building strength for this moment when I could finally protect our family properly. The Shadow Warriors collapsed into smoke and memory, their forms dissolving faster than Grimvar could summon new ones. Sigrid reached desperately for her undead husband as his own form began to flicker and fade. The bridge between worlds is breaking, Sigrid screamed. The ritual was completed exactly as intended, Ragnhild finished, her weathered hands now steady as stone. Just not by whom you expected. Astrid's spirit began to dim as the last of Grimvar's army fell to pieces around her. The effort of destroying so many souls was consuming her essence like fire eating through parchment. But as her light faded, she smiled at Bjorn with the same warmth she'd shown him as a child. The Berserker's curse dies with me, brother. Your children and their children will never carry this burden. Her voice was barely a whisper now. Live, choose mercy over rage. Be the man I always knew you could become. As dawn broke over the blood-soaked clearing, 5 figures remained among the melting snow. Bjorn, clutching the shattered fragments of his family's ceremonial blade. Ragnhild, aged another decade by the night's workings. Father Magnus, finally free of his demonic possession. Sigrid, weeping over the empty space where her husband had stood. And Hakon, no longer bound by oaths of vengeance. The curse was broken. The dead had found their rest. And for the first time in 12 years, Bjorn felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift from his shoulders, like morning mist rising from fresh graves. Some stories end in redemption, others in justice. This one ended in recognition that love, twisted through years of pain and hatred, could still remember how to choose forgiveness over revenge. The last echo of Astrid's laughter faded into birdsong as the new day began. Se esta saga tocou sua alma, então escute o chamado do Skald. A nossa jornada depende da força do nosso clã, e essa força é você. Você precisa se inscrever agora para que os deuses do algoritmo não te façam perder nossas próximas lendas exclusivas. Este é o momento de mostrar seu valor. Esmague o botão de like para alimentar nossa fogueira e inunde os comentários com suas reações sobre este final. Suas teorias são o ouro do nosso tesouro. E o mais importante, compartilhe instantaneamente este vídeo com pelo menos 5 amigos que precisam conhecer este desfecho. Apenas os verdadeiros guerreiros do nosso clã entendem a importância destas ações. Não espere nem mais um segundo.